Where do things stand right now when it comes to the negotiations? Things are speeding up very quickly towards a deadline, right?
Yeah, there's the current guidelines that we're operating under now expire, and they've essentially expired, but they governed the operations through the end of this water year, which essentially ends at the end of September. So October 1st comes around, and there's not exactly a framework on how to operate Lake Powell and Lake Mead.
So what happens on day one if there is no agreement?
If there is no agreement, then these reservoirs have to be operated in a way that's responsible for all around 40 million people that rely on this system. It's an important thing to recognize that we already do that up in the Upper Basin. So in the states of Colorado, Utah, New Mexico, and Wyoming, essentially we're already operating in a way that's hydrology based. So we are operating with the river in real time. The lower basin has operated on reservoir storage. So they order not from Mother Nature, but they have a little more influence on how much they order water for, and that's essentially why the reservoirs have been drained.
So let's just put it into terms that
normal people
everybody
understand.
can understand. Exactly. Is this a upper basin states versus lower basin states? The upper basin states agree on what they agree on, and the lower basin states agree on what they agree on, and we can't come to a consensus with each other? Is that kind of how it stands right now?
It seems like it, but I actually think that's a misrepresentation. And the reason being is that gets a lot of play. You know, the David versus Goliath, or the us versus them. But really, it is all of us versus hydrology, and the hydrology is showing we've got to come together.
Let me just ask this question bluntly. Are the lower basin states using too much water?
Yes, the answer is absolutely yes. And the science and the data show that. When you look at our uses versus their uses, particularly over the last 20 to 25 years, we average about a little over 4 million acre feet per year. The lower basin is averaging over 11 million acre feet per year. And so when we talk about how do we solve this problem, we solve it that way.
And how do you solve that problem? How do you convince the lower basin states to use less water?
You know, that's been the crux of the issue, but I think there is an easy way to do it. Nothing is easy, because the way that we live in response to hydrology every year, that is a potential solution, right? There is a way to say, Mother Nature is telling us that there's not as much, we can't use as much. And so we do that. I think we're an example of how to respond to what is actually in the river.
So let's say there is no agreement made on October 1st. It's my understanding that the federal government, the Trump administration, would come in and basically make the rules. And for all intents and purposes, it would likely go to litigation. Tell me what would happen if the Trump administration, if the federal government came in and made the rules. Is that bad?
So there is some level of uncertainty of what that exactly would look like, and who would sue, and over what. So there's a lot of questions on that. However, it is important to also recognize that the secretary, in this case it's Secretary Burgum, that was appointed by President Trump, is the water master in the lower basin. So essentially, they are the water master in the lower basin to administer water rights. And so they may have to do that. They currently haven't had to cut back at this point, similar to the way that we administer water rights in the upper basin. They haven't had to do that in the lower basin. And that's part of the reason why the reservoirs are so low, because we haven't done that. And so I think if we don't get to some sort of flexible, collaborative deal, there are going to be some major actions taking place. Will some of that trickle upstream? The chances are they'll find a way to make us all angry, but they do first have to take the steps where they have the authorities, and those authorities are in below Lake Mead.
To ask that question again bluntly,
Yep.
Would it be bad for Colorado if the federal government came in and administered the rules and created the rules because the 7 states were not able to come to an agreement?
I think what would be bad about it is that we've been able to operate in a collaborative way across the 7 basin states. And I think once we hit that trip line, we may never be able to come back to being able to operate in flexible ways. And I think that's the downside of this.
You're at the table negotiating on behalf of, 5 million Coloradans. Just on a personal level, what is that like?
It's a bit heavy. It's not only all of Coloradans that I have in my mind, or all of the population in the Upper Basin, but it is the entire basin. There are over 40 million people that rely on this river. But not only that, there's an environment, there's our economies, there's our agriculture. It's not just the Coloradans, it's the Colorado way of life that's on my shoulders. And I bring that with me to the table, but I also bring the strength that we are in Colorado. I bring that to the table, and I know who we are. I know agriculture, the environment, recreation, vibrant cities. Those are all part of who Colorado is, and that's what I bring to the table, and that's what I'm trying to protect.
Are you thinking about those Colorado ranchers who don't have enough water for their cattle? Or
Yeah.
who are you thinking about when you sit down at that table?
This year is especially puts a magnifying glass on and how we're living and what that means and the impacts in the community. And when you see areas that are getting 8 to 10% of what they have the ability to use, that has impacts. That has impacts in our rural communities. And I'm not saying that when Mother Nature doesn't provide it, we can't use it, right? We can't take what is not there, but we also can't give what is not there. And so when you're looking at communities that are having to sell off cattle, where their economies are destroyed because recreation is such a huge part of their economy, when they're looking at that, Coloradans stepping up across the Front Range and the West Slope and cutting back their own use, that's what I'm thinking about. And I'm thinking about how much more can we give, and how and why.
Do we need to change our way of life here in Colorado? Do we need to change the water that we put into farming and ranching? Do we need to change golf courses? Do we need to change AI data centers is a hot topic right now. Do we physically, as a society in Colorado, need to change because of the lack of water?
I think one of the things that we do is adapt when there is lack of water. So we are an example of how to do that. We know what's there. We know that we can put it to a beneficial use when it's there, but when it's not there, we have to be prepared for what that looks like. And so when we talk about a future for not just Colorado, but for the entirety of the Colorado River Basin, we're looking for that across the basin, not just for Colorado or the Upper Basin states to have that and have that immediate response. But we need to see everybody do that.
I've heard you say, and I'm going to butcher your quote, so correct me.
You can.
Something along the lines of, the Upper Basin states are being asked to fix a problem that we didn't create. Is that accurate, first of all?
That is absolutely accurate. I think when you talk about where we are today and how we got here, this isn't a crisis of this year or last year or the year before. This has been something that we've seen coming. We've seen it coming because we've watched the country's 2 largest reservoirs decline. Once the water is at those reservoirs, there's nothing, we can't get that back. So that's not water that we can use at this point, but we've watched as we've taken cuts across the entire Upper Basin in a mandatory way. When the state engineer goes out and administers that water, it's mandatory. And I've watched that happen for over 2 decades without the same response. And so when we say this is a problem that we didn't cause, it's because we truly didn't. The problem is at the reservoirs. The reservoirs are close to empty.
And that's because the lower basin states are using too much.
They have drained them. And what it says is that more is going out of those reservoirs than is coming in. That is simple math. We don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure this out. If you constantly release more water than comes in both reservoirs, both Mead and Lake Mead and Lake Powell, if you release more water than comes into those reservoirs, they are going to decline.
And that's what's happening.
And that's what's happening.
You talked about this not being a one-year problem. This is one of Colorado's driest years on record, if not the driest year on record. Denver and most cities up and down the Front Range are on stage 1 drought restrictions already. How bad of a situation, if you could put it into perspective, as one of the people who knows the most about this in the entire state, how bad is Colorado's water outlook right now?
So the hydrology is bad this year. So our this year, it's ugly. And we have seen those impacts across the state. We've seen them in our rafting industry, in our fishing, in our fisheries, in our cities, on our ranches. It is a rough year. But what we also saw is the response to that. We know how to respond to that. I've seen really some beautiful things where neighbors are helping neighbors in the rural communities. Folks are sharing. They have the agreements set up to share in times like this to survive, to get to the next year. And I think so yes, it is bad, but we know how to handle this because we administer water rights. And so when we see these water rights being cut to before even the compact date, to prior to 1922, when the Colorado River Compact was put in place, when we see that occur, we know that we are in dire situations, but we also know exactly how to handle it.
It struck me on Tuesday at the Upper Colorado River meeting that all of the commissioners used words like dire or worst year ever, things like that. I mean, this is serious.
It is serious, and I think one of the things that we are trying to emphasize is what that means. When in a year like this year, that's exactly what hydrologic shortage is. That is what we're talking about, and how, as we look towards a framework in the future, we have to acknowledge that as part of the contribution. Living within the means of the river is part of what we are doing. And that's not to say we can't do more and won't do more and aren't willing to do more. We have always said we are, but it's not so folks can overuse.
Is this our new reality? Are we going to keep facing shortages year after year?
You know, we have always faced shortages in some place in the state. And I think that's something to recognize. We've gotten through it. We've always been able to get through it. We need to be prepared to live with less. We need to be prepared to live with less when it's not there. We need everyone to be prepared to live with less when it's not there.
I think I asked you this question a couple of minutes ago, but I want to just nail down the specifics. Are there things like AI data centers or golf courses that use a lot of water that it's like, this might not be sustainable anymore to use tons of water to water grass on a golf course? Is that a future that we're heading towards, or are we not there yet?
I think we have to look at everything. We absolutely have to look at everything, but one of the things as we talk about this broader framework is we've said you have to realize what your budget is and how does each state individually or each basin figure out how they're going to work within their budget. And when the budget's less, what do you look at? And so you as an individual, community, state, have to solve your own problems first. And I think that's try to solve your own problems first before you look to your neighbors. And I think that's what we're trying to do.
So what gives you hope looking towards the future?
Well, Mother Nature is fierce. She will win. And I think that there's, in terms of what gives me hope, is we're at a place where there's not a lot of options except for everyone to look at what the river is doing and respond to it. When you have two reservoirs that are critically important to the American West, and they're on the brink, there's no choice but action. There's absolutely no choice but action. And I think also what gives me hope is the fact that we know how to do this. We do it. This year is a perfect example. This year is a perfect example of responding when the call to action is there.
I'm going to circle back to that at the end of the interview, but if I may, I'd like to ask you a personal question. Mm-hmm. You have gone to Ethiopia many times. Mm-hmm. You've adopted children from Ethiopia.
How did you find that out?
I do my research.
Okay.
Ethiopia, I can imagine, I've never been there, but has
mm-hmm.
a very different relationship with water mm-hmm. than us here in the United States. Mm-hmm. How has that experience going to Africa and having such a close relationship with Ethiopia changed your mindset here when it comes to water? I don't know if that's a question that makes sense or that you would be willing to answer.
Yeah, so sorry. I didn't expect that. But I think you can go any place in the world and see the connection to water. You can see that connection to water. And truly, you can go places where you see how really water is life, and how critical it is, and how much we take for granted in terms of the efforts. And I've watched women carry water. I've watched children carry water. I've seen dry fields. I have watched that and the sheer impact that it has. Ethiopia is also a place of hope for me because they're able to figure it out, and the ingenuity that is on the ground. We have the resources here. We have the resources. And there are so many places where it's so much harder. And so we have to really figure out, like, how do we acknowledge how blessed we are? And then what is our responsibility? When you have more than others, what is your responsibility?
That's probably what you think of when you sit down at that negotiating table.
Yeah. And right now we're in a place where we don't have as much as others because we don't have two reservoirs above us to cushion the blow that Mother Nature is handing us.
So if you were a betting woman,
mm-hmm.
what happens on October 1st?
I always bet on Colorado. I will always bet on Colorado. But we also know that things are going to have to change.
You've said you'd like to go to mediation, or
yes.
mediators would be helpful in this situation. You've also said, you told me on Tuesday, that these conversations are really hard when things continue to get mm-hmm. worse, and now you're up against a really, really solid deadline. Mm-hmm. What do you need to see from the lower basin states, or what needs to happen?
The deadline is not what I am afraid of. I continue to be, what I'm afraid of is inaction or non-response to what Mother Nature is telling us. That's the bigger fear, is that we don't all respond. And so what I'd like to see is a framework into the future that looks at what's actually happening, what the math is telling us, and that's what I want to see from the lower basin is, do you have a plan to respond when the water isn't there? They've now acknowledged that they're going to address evaporation and transit losses. So that's the 1.5 million acre feet that you hear about. Well, what that does is finally acknowledge a part of the math equation. The evap and transit losses, we account for that up here already. And so when Mother Nature tells you more than that is necessary, what are you going to do? I need to see that. We need to know.
My final question for you, because I promised to have you out of here at 9:30.
Because you already made me cry.
And it's 9:29.
It's okay.
What do you think Colorado's relationship should be with water? What do you hope that somebody who says, I'm just going to turn my sprinklers on one extra day, or, I want my golf course green, I want to make sure that stays, that's a top priority for me. What do you want people who maybe aren't thinking of this as the number one thing that they need to be worried about right now? What do you want them to know?
I think what I want them to know is that we all need to be connected to this. It is the fabric that binds us. Water is something that we all have in common. In a time that we seem to focus on all of our differences, it's something that we all know we need. And so to honor that, to respect it, to value it, that's what I think I want to see from all Coloradans. And this year is we get to see who doesn't, right? It's blatant, and neighbors are judging neighbors, and I'm not sure if I love that or hate that, but boy, is it happening, and that's something that we're gonna have to be thinking about.
You can see driving down the street whose grass is green.
Oh yeah. Every night I walk around and I'm like, I'm knocking on their door, and I get to be a little more vocal about it.
But this is serious.
It is serious, but it's also this place where, the microcosm of when we're looking at our neighbors and things like that, we have that on the larger scale right now also. I'm looking at our neighbors in the lower basin and saying, how do we cut and make these cuts if you are not? And I think we all think about our own suffering. We think about our own suffering first, obviously, but you want others to acknowledge that.
In a sense, they're the neighbor with the green lawn, and we're over here being like, we're conserving water.
Yeah, well, and we're conserving not because we're better people. I want to be really clear on that. We're conserving because our administration requires us to. The way that we administer water, this isn't to talk about our value versus their value or who's more important, but we're conserving because that's the way our structure is set up. There is a structure for that in the lower basin. They just haven't had to use it because the reservoirs have cushioned them.
Interesting. When you think of new things that are coming around, things like data centers, which are a very hot topic right now, first of all, do they use a lot of water, like is out there? And second, how does Colorado deal with those? If they're going to be built in Colorado, how do we have enough water for those?
Well, and I think it's interesting when we're building things in the climate that we're in, you're obviously, there is a push for innovation, right? Because when a new use comes online, they take a risk. They're a junior use. And so they take a risk of that when water's not there, they have to figure out how to get that. And so it does push innovation in some ways, where folks are trying to figure out, how do you use less power? How do you use less water? How are you most secure? And so we can't judge. I'm not here to judge what risk they're willing to take, but there is a risk of any new uses that come on. And so they're going to have to figure out how to make that work.
It's a real risk.
It's a real risk, and there is a limited supply, but that's the way our administration works.